Ethan Walker had everything a man could buy except the family he was losing. After years of burying his grief in billion-dollar deals, he returned home one quiet Manhattan evening to find his triplet sons kneeling in prayer beside the new maid, Rosemary Collins. In that moment, something broke open inside him, and the life he'd been avoiding finally caught up. Ethan Walker had spent most of his adult life climbing to the peak of American success, the kind that looked glamorous from the outside but felt strangely hollow at the top. People in New York City spoke his name with a kind of awe reserved for men who turned technology into empires. And he had indeed done that, building Walker Dynamics from a small Boston startup into one of the most powerful tech companies in the country. At 41, he was the kind of figure magazines like to put on their covers: sharp-jawed, stoic, disciplined. The embodiment of the American dream wrapped in a tailored suit. But beneath those layers of achievement was a man who had forgotten what home was supposed to feel like. Somewhere along the way, the world applauded his success so loudly that he stopped noticing the pieces of his life that were falling apart behind him. It hadn't always been like that. Before the accident, before the grief that rearranged his life in ways spreadsheets couldn't calculate, Ethan had been someone different. He had been a husband who came home early just to watch his wife laugh at her own cooking mistakes, and a father who used to crawl on the carpet with 3 identical toddlers who wanted nothing more than his attention. Grace, beautiful, warm, endlessly patient, had been the center of their home. She carried a softness that balanced out Ethan's ambition, grounding him when the corporate world threatened to swallow him whole. Their penthouse in Manhattan wasn't just luxurious. It had been alive, full of conversations that never had to be planned and small moments that stitched their family together. When the accident took Grace away, it didn't just steal Ethan's wife. It removed the heart of their home and replaced it with a void he didn't know how to face. He tried in the early weeks to sit with his boys and explain why their mother wasn't coming back. But Liam's anger, Caleb's anxious questions, and Noah's stunned wordlessness were more than he could carry. Every attempt felt like failure. Every moment with them reminded him of what he'd lost. So he did the one thing he knew how to do. He worked. Meetings became escapes, business trips became shields, and the buzz of productivity drowned out the ache that waited for him whenever he returned to New York. But children don't freeze simply because adults do. The triplets grew, and with that growth came behaviors that unsettled even the most experienced caregivers. Liam screamed over everything, breaking toys and throwing tantrums that no one could soothe. Caleb developed sudden stomach aches whenever emotional tension rose, clutching his belly until he cried. And Noah, the quietest of the 3, barely spoke at all, retreating into a world only he seemed to understand. The nanny turnover rate in the Walker penthouse became infamous at the agency. Some quit after a day, others after a week. No one stayed long enough to notice what the kids truly needed. Ethan told himself they would adapt. Kids were resilient, they'd grow out of it. Counselors tried to express concern, teachers recommended more parental involvement. But Ethan brushed off every suggestion with the kind of polite detachment that only powerful men could afford. He wasn't unkind, just overwhelmed in a way he didn't know how to admit. If he slowed down long enough to feel anything, he worried the weight of it would bury him, so he buried himself in work instead, convincing himself that providing financially was enough, that the boys would understand one day. That grief didn't need presence, only time. But time didn't heal, it stretched. The penthouse remained immaculate, hyper-organized and lifeless. The windows overlooked Central Park, but the beauty felt wasted on a man who rarely looked outside. The kids' rooms were filled with expensive toys that none of them used. Their closets lined with clothes bought by assistants who didn't know their sizes or preferences. Ethan's mother, Margaret Walker, visited often enough to keep up appearances. She believed structure was the solution to everything: private tutors, elite manners classes, strict schedules. Ethan let her take control because it was easier than confronting the truth. The boys didn't need discipline. They needed someone who could love them without expecting anything in return. He didn't realize how far gone things were until one Thursday afternoon when he returned from a meeting in San Francisco earlier than expected. He wasn't planning to come home. He usually stayed the night in a hotel and flew back the next morning. But something unexplainable tugged at him, an impulse to return to Manhattan sooner than usual. When the elevator opened into his penthouse, he stepped into a stillness he didn't recognize. Not the natural quiet of a home resting, but the kind that hinted something was missing. He called for his sons, but no one answered. Their absence felt sharp. As he walked deeper into the penthouse, a strange uneasiness crept up his spine. The living room was untouched, the kitchen too tidy, the hallway dim. He checked room after room, growing more unsettled with every empty space. When he finally reached the last door at the end of the hall, he braced himself for chaos, maybe a mess, Maybe another tantrum. Maybe something broken. But when he pushed the door open, he found something entirely different. There were his 3 boys, all kneeling beside a woman he barely recognized, someone new, someone gentle, someone who somehow had their complete attention. Rosemary Collins, a temporary maid from Georgia, was guiding them through a soft prayer. Ethan watched from the doorway, unsure why his breath caught in his chest. Liam was whispering about trying not to be angry that day. Caleb thanked God that his stomach didn't hurt. Noah, who hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in months, held Rosemary's hand with a peace Ethan had never seen. Something shifted inside him, a crack forming in the emotional armor he'd been wearing for years. He felt his throat tighten, his eyes sting, his body tremble. He hadn't cried since Grace's funeral, but standing there, watching his sons connect with someone so effortlessly, the tears came. He realized with a painful clarity that while he had been absent, someone else had stepped into the space he abandoned and brought a tenderness he didn't know how to give. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan saw his life not from the perspective of a CO or a grieving husband, but as a father who had been missing too long. That moment would change everything, but Ethan didn't know it yet. All he knew was that something inside him had awakened, demanding he finally look at the home he had neglected, and the people inside it who needed him far more than his company ever would. Rosemary Collins had not expected Manhattan to be the place where her life took a turn. She wasn't planning to stay long, either. She had left Savannah with 2 suitcases, a worn notebook, and a small envelope of savings that seemed to shrink every time she opened it. Working as a cleaning contractor wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And steady was enough for someone who'd grown up learning that stability was a privilege, not a guarantee. Still, she never imagined she'd end up in the penthouse of Ethan Walker, the name practically stamped on half the tech billboards around Times Square. When the agency called her at the last minute begging her to take a temporary cleaning job for a high-profile client, she didn't ask questions. She needed the hours, they needed someone willing to show up. It felt simple. The moment she stepped inside the Walker penthouse, she realized nothing about this job was going to be simple. The place was immaculate, but not in a warm or welcoming way. It felt curated, almost museum-like. There were framed awards along the hallway, expensive furniture arranged as if professionally staged, and a kitchen full of high-end appliances that looked unused. Yet beneath all the luxury, Rosemary sensed something was deeply wrong. She heard a thud from the living room, followed by a frustrated wail. Then another noise, this one more like a muffled cry. Within 10 minutes, she found herself standing in front of 3 boys who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, each of them carrying a different kind of storm inside. Liam, the boldest of the 3, glared at her like she'd trespassed into his private world. Caleb clutched his stomach, insisting it hurt even though there was no sign of illness. Noah, the quietest, watched her with wide, observant eyes, as if waiting to see whether she was another adult who would vanish by dinner time. Rosemary had worked with children before, but she had never encountered grief this raw, this exposed. Their emotions weren't subtle or hidden. They erupted without warning like firecrackers thrown onto concrete. When Liam threw a toy truck across the room in her direction, she ducked and took a small breath. Most people would have marched straight out after that. Most nannies clearly had. But Rosemary didn't turn back. She bent down, picked up the truck, and gently set it on the table without saying a word. The boys looked confused. They were used to adults who scolded, bribed, or walked out, not someone who simply stayed. Later that afternoon, when Caleb knocked over a cup of juice and immediately burst into tears, she didn't sigh or call for help. She crouched down, handed him a towel, and said, "Come on, sweetheart. We'll do it together." His small hands wiped the floor beside hers, and though he didn't smile, something in his shoulders eased. Noah hovered in the doorway, watching like someone witnessing a new species of adult for the first time. By the end of her first week, Rosemary had seen more emotional chaos than most caregivers saw in a year. Liam tried to lock her in a supply closet. Caleb cried over broken crayons. Noah refused to speak at all, communicating only through subtle gestures or the way he positioned objects around his room. Yet none of it scared her. In fact, she recognized it, not from textbook psychology or training she never received, but from lived experience. She had grown up in a home where people shut down instead of talking, where hurt turned into shouting and shouting turned into long nights with no apologies. She learned early that sometimes the greatest gift you can give another person is simply not leaving. One Friday evening, after a particularly rough day where Liam shouted that he hated everything and everyone, Rosemary sat on the carpet and spoke softly, more to herself than to the boys. "You don't have to be afraid for me to see you. You can yell, you can cry, you can even push me away. I won't run." Her voice was gentle, steady, without any expectation. Liam froze mid-gesture. Caleb sniffled. No looked up for the first time in hours. They didn't embrace her or thank her, of course. Traumatized children don't respond like that. Instead, Liam sat down across from her, not too close but closer than before. Caleb crawled under a blanket. No placed a tiny rock beside her knee, unsure why he did it, only knowing it felt right. Over time, Rosemary began to understand each boy's triggers. Liam was angry because anger felt safer than sorrow. Caleb's stomach hurt because anxiety always found a physical home. No avoided speaking because talking meant exposing the H he didn't know how to name. They weren't disobedient, they were hurting. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain. She cared for them like they were her own. Every night she pushed their beds together and told them stories she made up on the spot, tales of lost turtles who found their way home, brave little lions searching for their mother, or tiny trees trying to grow in hard soil. The boys pretended not to like them, rolling their eyes or burying their faces in pillows, but their breathing softened, their bodies relaxed. And Rosemary knew she was reaching them in ways words alone couldn't. She noticed the way No inched closer each night, the way Caleb's hand found hers without asking, the way Liam's anger reduced from explosive to manageable. She didn't teach them grand lessons. She taught them small consistency snacks waiting after school, apple slices peeled for Caleb, gentle humming whenever a storm rolled across the Manhattan skyline. The agency never trained her on how to handle grief. Life had done that. And because she understood the weight of loss, she didn't demand the boys forget theirs. She held space for it. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was unmistakable. Teachers reported fewer behavioral issues. The doorman noticed the boys laughing occasionally. Even the security staff said the household felt lighter. Rosemary noticed the boys seeking her out, Liam bringing her a drawing, Caleb asking her to check his backpack, No leaving little objects on her bedside table like offerings. The penthos still carried its coldness, but warmth began creeping in through small, unassuming cracks. If Ethan had been home more, he might have seen the shift earlier. But he was traveling constantly, San Francisco, Chicago, Tokyo, each trip sealing him a little further into the world that rewarded his absence. Rosemary didn't blame him. Grief affects adults as messily as it does children, they just hide it better. Still, she wished he knew what he was missing. Everything changed the afternoon Ethan returned early. He wasn't supposed to, no one expected him. Rosemary had just gathered the boys for a quick moment of prayer, something they had begun doing voluntarily before dinner, when the door opened behind them. Liam whispered gratitude for not feeling as angry that day. Caleb thanked God for the pain in his stomach easing. No held Rosemary's hand with a calmness that seemed impossible a month earlier. Rosemary didn't see Ethan standing there, watching, breathing unevenly. She didn't know that the sight of his children opening their hearts again would hit him harder than any business deal ever could. That moment became the axis on which their lives would turn. The moment when Ethan realized someone else had stepped into the role he'd abandoned. And from that realization, everything that came after, every conflict, every journey, every healing would unfold. Ethan Walker had prepared himself for chaos when he reached the last door of the hallway. After years of coming home to tantrums, broken toys, and raised voices, he expected another scene that would remind him just how disconnected he'd become from his own children. His hand rested on the doorknob for a moment longer than necessary, his breath steady but weighted. He wasn't afraid of noise, he was afraid of facing the truth. He'd been avoiding the truth that his boys were hurting, and he didn't know how to help them. But what he found on the other side of that door didn't resemble anything he had braced himself for. There on the soft carpet of the nursery were his 3 sons kneeling, not wrestling, not throwing things, not crying, kneeling. Their heads were bowed, their small hands clasped together, and sitting with them, her voice low and comforting, was the new maid he'd barely acknowledged when she arrived. Rosemary Collins looked almost out of place in the vast penthouse, like someone who carried a different world with her. Yet somehow she was the one holding his children's attention with a tenderness he hadn't seen in years. Ethan stood in the doorway, his briefcase forgotten at his feet. His mind searched for a logical explanation, something rational, something that made this moment less jarring. But nothing came, he could only watch. Rosemary's words drifted through the room with a warmth so genuine it pressed against him like a physical force. Even when life feels heavy, she whispered, there is still a presence bigger than our worries, and we can talk to him anytime we need. For a moment, Ethan thought the boys wouldn't speak. But then Liam, the one who usually responded to everything with anger, spoke first. Thank you for helping me not get mad at school today, he murmured. The softness in his tone stunned Ethan. The boy who shouted at teachers, slammed doors, and kicked chairs was now kneeling with gratitude in his voice. Then Caleb spoke, fidgeting with his shirt. Thank you for Rosemary and for making my stomach not hurt today. Ethan swallowed hard. He had known Caleb struggled with anxiety, but he didn't know it had grown into physical pain daily. Hearing his son speak about it so openly pierced him deeply. Finally, Noah, the quietest of the three, reached out and held Rosemary's hand. He didn't speak, not with words, but the expression on his face said more than sentences ever could. A soft trust, an unguarded peace, a sense of safety so fragile yet so profound it pushed something inside Ethan to move. He took one step backward to steady himself, one hand bracing against the wall as if the ground had shifted beneath him. He wasn't ready for what was happening inside him. He had built walls around his emotions for years. Not intentionally, not aggressively, just bit by bit, meeting by meeting, flight by flight, until his grief had no place left to settle except behind a locked door in his chest. But watching his children like that, so small, so vulnerable, finding comfort in the arms of a woman he barely knew, cracked that door open in an instant. His throat tightened before he understood why. His eyes burned. He blinked hard, but the tears were insistent, rising from a place long untouched. He hadn't cried since Grace's funeral. He'd worked through the pain, pushed through it, negotiated with it until it dulled into something he could ignore. But now, out of nowhere, the weight of everything he'd been avoiding surged through him. Not with violence, but with a devastating gentleness he couldn't defend himself against. This was what he'd been missing. Not order, not discipline, not wealth, presence, real, human presence. Something Rosemary had given his children in the span of weeks, something he hadn't given them in years. He remembered Grace telling him once, while holding the boys during a sleepless night, "These kids don't need a perfect father, Ethan. They just need you." Back then, he kissed her forehead and promised he'd always be there. Now the memory felt like a broken vow echoing through the room. Rosemary hadn't noticed him yet. She continued speaking softly, her thumb gently tracing circles on Noah's knuckles. "You can tell God anything," she said. "You thank him. You can ask him things. And if you're upset, you can even tell him that. He's not going anywhere." Those last 5 words hit Ethan harder than anything else. Not go anywhere. The phrase felt like a lifeline tossed into the ocean he'd been drifting in. The boys needed that kind of stability. They needed someone who showed up. Someone who didn't walk out when their emotions became too much. And while Ethan loved them more than he could express, he suddenly realized he hadn't been that person for them. But Rosemary had. He stepped fully inside the room now, though quietly enough that no one noticed. He didn't want to interrupt, he wanted to absorb. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the presence of his sons not as responsibilities or extensions of his legacy, but as children who were desperately trying to piece themselves back together after losing their mother. They were trying to grow in soil that had been neglected for too long. Rosemary had watered that soil without asking for anything in return. When the boys finished their prayer, Rosemary helped them up gently, brushing stray hair from their eyes, straightening their shirts, offering the kind of care people usually receive only from someone who loves them deeply. It made Ethan ache in a way he hadn't felt since the night he lost Grace. Not because Rosemary was replacing his wife, no one could, but because she had stepped into a void he'd been too afraid to confront. And then, almost as if drawn by instinct, Rosemary looked up and saw him. Her expression didn't change dramatically, no gasp, no startled jump, but her eyes widened just slightly, enough to show she understood what he might have witnessed. Ethan didn't speak right away. He couldn't. His voice wouldn't have been steady. Instead, he offered a small nod, one that carried gratitude, apology, and disbelief all at once. Rosemary lowered her gaze respectfully, not expecting praise or panic, just acknowledging him with a quiet humility that made his chest tighten again. The boys turned then, their faces lighting up when they noticed their father. "Dad!" Liam exclaimed, running toward him. Caleb followed, and even Noah moved closer, tugging at Ethan's sleeve. They surrounded him, their energy warm and chaotic, demanding attention he wasn't used to giving but suddenly craved. Ethan placed a hand on each of their backs, pulling them close. It felt unfamiliar, at first awkward, stiff but then natural, like his body remembered something his mind had forgotten. He looked at Rosemary over their shoulders, and she offered the faintest smile. Not proud, not triumphant, just encouraging, inviting him to step back into his children's world. That night, long after the boys drifted off to sleep, Ethan sat alone in the guest bathroom, the one Grace used to fill with candles and soft fragrances, and let himself feel everything he had spent years avoiding. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know how to fix the past. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: something had shifted inside him the moment he saw his children kneeling beside Rosemary Collins. And he wasn't going to ignore it anymore. The morning after Ethan witnessed his sons praying with Rosemary, he woke earlier than usual, long before the sun filtered through the Manhattan skyline. His body felt heavy, as if grief and awakening had collided overnight and reshaped him from the inside out. For years he had avoided quiet mornings like this, filling them with conference calls and emails so he wouldn't have to think about what was missing in his home. But today something nudged him out of bed, not obligation, not routine, but a need he couldn't ignore. He wanted to be present. He wanted to show up. He walked into the kitchen and fumbled with the coffee maker, realizing he hadn't brewed his own cup in years. Assistants usually handled it, or he grabbed one from his driver on the way to the office. But today he wanted to do something simple, something real. He cracked eggs into a pan, burned 2 slices of toast, and nearly set off the smoke alarm before managing a halfway decent breakfast. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small step towards something better. When Rosemary walked in, notebook in hand and hair pulled back, she froze at the sight of Ethan standing by the stove. She blinked as if unsure whether she had walked into the wrong penthouse. "Good morning, Mr. Walker," she said softly. Ethan cleared his throat, embarrassed by the mess he'd made. "I thought I'd make breakfast for the boys," he replied. "I don't usually do this, but I'd like to try." There was a hesitation in his voice he couldn't hide. Rosemary nodded with understanding, not pity. She stepped beside him, gently lowering the heat on the burner before the eggs turned to rubber. "They'll appreciate the effort," she said. "Kids notice things like that, even if they pretend they don't." Before he could reply, 3 pairs of small feet came running into the room. Liam barreled in first, sliding across the hardwood floor like it was a baseball base. Caleb followed behind him with bedhead sticking out in every direction. Noah trailed last, rubbing his eyes, still half asleep. All 3 froze when they saw their father at the counter. Liam narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "Dad, why are you home?" Ethan forced a smile that felt surprisingly genuine. "I missed you." The boys stared at him, unsure how to respond. They were used to him appearing and disappearing without warning, always moving through the penthos like a man passing through a train station, never staying long enough to be considered truly present. Rosemary stepped closer, giving the boys a small nod of encouragement. Liam climbed onto his chair first, Caleb followed. Noah settled between his brothers. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. During breakfast, Ethan tried to ask about their day, favorite subjects in school, or what they wanted to do for the weekend. Liam shrugged through most of the questions. Caleb answered quietly, nibbling on the edge of his toast. Noah didn't speak but watched Ethan carefully, studying him like he was a puzzle missing too many pieces. It was awkward, unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Rosemary stayed nearby, tittying the counters but subtly guiding the boys when their nerves kicked in. Her presence steadied the room. As the boys gathered their backpacks, Ethan walked with Rosemary to the hallway. He hesitated before speaking. "I owe you more than thanks. Yesterday what you did for them." He paused, searching for the right words. "I didn't know they still remembered how to pray." Rosemary held her notebook against her chest. "They were looking for connection," she said. "Kids always are. Sometimes they find it in places adults stop looking." Her words hit deeper than she realized. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight with emotion he tried to hide. "If you ever need anything, resources, help, please tell me. I'm grateful." She smiled, gentle and modest. "I'm just doing my job, Ma. Walker." But they both knew that wasn't true. What she was giving the boys wasn't part of any job description. That evening, Ethan made a choice he hadn't made in a long time. He canceled a meeting. His assistant nearly fainted on the phone. When the boys returned from school, they found their father actually home, sitting on the couch waiting. Liam eyed him again. "You still here?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I wanted to hear about your day." The boys exchanged glances like they'd stumbled onto a rare phenomenon, and eventually, they sat with him. For the first time in months, they talked about teachers, playground drama, and the saplings Rosemary helped them plant on the balcony. Caleb excitedly described how his tree had sprouted a tiny leaf. Noah ran to his room and came back with a jar full of labeled rocks, showing Ethan the new ones he added. Liam pretended not to care but leaned closer whenever Ethan laughed. Later, Rosemary appeared in the hallway, watching quietly. She didn't interrupt, didn't step in. She simply observed the scene with a small smile tugging at her lips, knowing exactly how much this moment meant. Ethan met her eyes and offered a nod, not a commanding one, not a businesslike gesture, just genuine gratitude. She nodded back. After the boys went to bed, Ethan lingered outside their room, listening to their soft breathing, their shifting blankets, their small worlds settling for the night. For years he had avoided moments like this because they hurt too much, reminding him of Grace. But now the ache didn't push him away. It pulled him closer. He felt the threads reconnecting, fragile but real. Down the hall, Rosemary was organizing cleaning supplies when Ethan approached. "Can we talk?" he asked. She looked up, cautious but open. Of course, he leaned against the doorway, unsure where to start. "I've been gone too long," he admitted. "And I think you've been holding this family together without ever being asked to." Rosemary tightened her grip on the notebook. "I just didn't want them to feel alone. And you did more than that, Ethan said. You made them feel safe again. The admiration in his voice made her look down. She wasn't used to praise, especially from someone like him, a man whose approval carried weight across boardrooms and stock markets. Yet this felt different. It wasn't corporate appreciation. It was personal. They were good boys, Rosemary said. They just needed someone to see them. Grief is heavy for kids. They don't know how to carry it without help. Ethan exhaled slowly. I didn't know how to help them, he confessed. I didn't even know how to help myself. Rosemary met his eyes then, her expression softening. You here now, that matters. He nodded. I want to keep being here for them. And if you willing, I'd like you to keep helping me understand them. She hesitated, then smiled, of course. Over the next few days, Ethan stayed home more often. He showed up for breakfast, helped Liam practice spelling words, and learned how to read Caleb's anxious tics before they worsened. He sat with No during quiet moments, not forcing conversation, just offering companionship. And every time he struggled, every time he felt lost, Rosemary was there, steady, patient, guiding him with a kind understanding he hadn't felt in years. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable began to unfold in the Walker home. Not perfection, not miraculous healing, but connection. Genuine, growing connection. Ethan wasn't just present. He was beginning to rebuild the father he used to be, the one Grace believed in, the one his sons still needed. And though he didn't fully realize it yet, Rosemary wasn't just helping him reconnect with his children. She was helping him rediscover his own heart. As the days passed, Rosemary Collins became something of an unspoken constant in the Walker penthos, a presence that wove itself naturally into the routines of three wounded boys who had forgotten what consistency felt like. She didn't force herself into their world or demand their trust. She simply showed up day after day, steady and patient, with a softness that felt entirely foreign in the cold, polished apartment. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boys began to turn toward her like plants reaching for sunlight. Liam was the hardest to read at first. His anger flared without warning, sparked by the smallest trigger, a broken pencil, a misplaced shoe, a rule he didn't want to follow. But Rosemary understood that anger was rarely the true emotion. It was armor, a shield he used to keep people from seeing the H underneath. She didn't fight him when he yelled. She didn't scold him when he kicked a chair. She waited. She let him ride the wave of emotion until he could breathe again. And when the storm passed, she was still there, calm and grounded, offering him a towel to clean up whatever mess he'd made and a space to sit where no one judged him. One afternoon, after Liam slammed his bedroom door so hard that a picture frame rattled on the wall, Rosemary knocked gently and asked, "Can you draw what you feeling instead?" He rolled his eyes and muttered something rude, but she left a blank sketch pad on his desk anyway. By the next morning, the first page was filled chaotic lines, angry colors, sharp shapes, but it was expression. It was a beginning. Caleb needed something entirely different. His emotions rarely exploded outward like Liam's. Instead, they turned inward, wrapping around his stomach until he doubled over with discomfort. Rosemary noticed early on how often he clutched his middle, how his eyes darted nervously whenever things felt unpredictable. She began slicing his apples into thin moons because he once mentioned they were easier to eat that way. She learned which textures made his anxiety spike and adjusted his meals without calling attention to it. And when his stomach aches grew too overwhelming, she sat beside him on the couch, rubbing slow circles on his back while quietly humming old gospel tunes from her childhood. Caleb pretended not to care, staring at the TV without watching it, but his shoulders slowly relaxed under her touch. One evening, he whispered, "My tummy doesn't hurt when you here," and Rosemary had to blink away her own emotion to respond. No, meanwhile, carried his grief differently. He retreated into a world built of small collections, arranged objects, and quiet observation. He spoke only when absolutely necessary, preferring gestures and the placement of items to communicate his feelings. Rosemary discovered a tiny stone in her coat pocket one morning, smooth and round with a faint blue tint. She knew instantly it was from No. It was his way of saying he trusted her. That simple act touched her in a way she couldn't explain. From that day forward, she kept a small jar on the windowsill labeled "Things That Matter," a place where No could safely leave his treasures. Pebbles, bottle caps, scraps of colored paper, each one represented a piece of his heart offered cautiously, and she treated every item with reverence. He watched her closely during those moments, studying her reactions with the keen eyes of a child who knew too well what it felt like to be overlooked. Despite their differences, the boys shared one thing: they gravitated toward Rosemary as if she were the one stable point in a world too often shaken by loss. She didn't try to replace their mother. She simply created moments of connection they desperately needed, small ones, ordinary ones, the kind adults often overlook. She remembered which boy liked socks that didn't itch. She learned their favorite cartoon episodes. She kept track of which stuffed animal belonged in which bed. These tiny acts, so simple on the surface, began weaving threads of trust between her and each child. Friday afternoons became their ritual. Rosemary would drag out a dusty cardboard box she found tucked behind the balcony storage cabinet. Inside were gardening supplies barely used. With a little improvisation and enthusiasm, she transformed the balcony into a makeshift garden. She handed each boy a small pot and a sapling. "We were going to help these grow," she said, "not quickly, but slowly." "Growing takes care." Liam scoffed at the idea, saying planting was boring, but he still poked the soil with surprising care. Caleb examined the roots with curiosity, asking endless questions about how plants knew which direction to grow. No didn't say a word. He just placed his sapling gently into the soil, patting it the way Rosemary had shown him. As the weeks passed, those saplings became symbols of something deeper. Whenever the boys watered them, Rosemary reminded them things grow when someone shows up for them. The words sank into the boys without effort, shaping their understanding of love, care, and presence. Sometimes Ethan caught sight of the gardening sessions from his home office window. He saw Rosemary kneeling beside his children, teaching them patience, cheering when a new leaf appeared. He saw his sons smiling, a sight so rare it nearly knocked the air out of him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't approach. He simply watched, trying to comprehend how she had managed to bring life into a home that had felt stagnant for so long. By the end of her second month, the results of Rosemary's influence were unmistakable. Liam's temper hadn't vanished, but he learned to breathe before reacting, often storming into her presence not to yell but to vent. Caleb's stomach aches decreased dramatically, replaced with cautious laughter whenever she told stories about her childhood in Georgia. No began seeking her out with quiet expectancy, tugging her sleeve when he wanted her attention, or placing new objects into her jar with faint pride. Each boy in his own way had begun healing. Rosemary saw it clearly even if they didn't. But what she didn't expect was how deeply she began caring for them, not as a caretaker, not as an employee, but as someone whose own heart kept reaching out to theirs. She found herself thinking about them on her days off, wondering whether Liam had mastered the spelling test he'd studied for, or if Caleb remembered to bring his jacket to school, or whether No found any new stones to show her. She prayed for them at night without intending to. She carried their worries in her chest, tucked between her own. Still, Rosemary told no one how much she was growing attached, not the agency, not her mother in Savannah, and certainly not Ethan Walker, whose presence in the penthos was increasing in small but meaningful ways. He asked her questions, real questions, not just about the boys, but about her days, her interests, her thoughts. She answered politely but carefully, maintaining boundaries that protected her from drifting too close to something that couldn't possibly be meant for her. Because Rosemary knew hard truths, she grew up understanding that people like her didn't belong in the worlds of billionaires, boardrooms, and penthouses overlooking Central Park. She knew that kindness could be misinterpreted. She knew that attachment could become dangerous. Yet despite all that, she continued to show up. She kept loving the boys in quiet, steady ways, even if loving them meant her heart would ache later. Every night, after the boys were asleep and the penthos had settled into its gentle rhythm, she would pause by the balcony, glance at the saplings and whisper a small prayer. Not for herself, for them. For their growth, their healing, their future. She didn't realize it yet. But those nightly prayers were shaping something far greater than she imagined, and something that would tie her fate to theirs in ways that would soon become impossible to untangle. While the Walker penthos slowly shifted under Rosemary's tender care, Ethan remained caught between two worlds: the demanding empire he'd built and the home that was evolving without him. His calendar stayed full of red-eye flights, boardroom negotiations, and late-night strategy calls. He told himself that stepping away now would be reckless, that the company needed him, that investors counted on his presence. And for a long time he believed those excuses. But each time he returned home, even for brief stretches, he saw changes that unsettled him in ways work never could. He noticed how Liam no longer stomped through the hallways with that wild intensity that once defined his every move. Now, when frustration hit, he sprinted to the balcony to check on the saplings, grounding himself before the anger consumed him. Ethan didn't understand the significance at first. He would stand in the doorway, watching Liam crouch over the small tree he had planted, whispering things under his breath that only Rosemary would understand. The boy always straightened up a little taller afterward, like the plants were teaching him resilience in ways words never could. Caleb, who once curled into corners clutching his stomach, now showed a steady routine of walking into the kitchen after school and immediately setting his backpack on the counter. That move alone was a seismic shift. He didn't look afraid of doing something wrong. He didn't flinch at unexpected noises. He sat at the table and waited for the apple slices Rosemary always prepared the same way, thin moons that made him feel understood. He'd nibble on them while talking softly about his day. And though Ethan often caught only the last few bits of conversation when he walked through the door, it was enough to see how much lighter the boy had become. And then there was his quiet observer. Though the child still rarely spoke, there was a newfound brightness in his expression. He seemed more alive, more grounded, especially when hovering around Rosemary like a shadow that found its light source. Whenever Ethan saw him gently place another found object into his jar labeled things that matter, he felt a tug in his chest he didn't know how to name. No had started smiling more, not big, flashy smiles, but small, warm ones that appeared when Rosemary ruffled his hair or knelt to his level. Ethan hadn't realized how rare that smile was until he saw it repeated. One evening, Ethan sat in the back of his chauffeured car, scrolling through emails, when he paused at a message from his assistant. It contained a report from the boys' school counselor, someone he had never met but paid generously. The counselor wrote that the boys had shown significant emotional progress in recent weeks, particularly in cooperation, communication, and emotional regulation. Whatever has changed at home, she wrote, it is working. Ethan leaned back in his seat, stunned. He hadn't changed anything. The only new variable was Rosemary. Yet he still didn't fully grasp how essential she had become to the boys. He only caught fragments: Liam sprinting toward her after a rough day, Caleb cling to her arm during thunderstorms, No sitting beside her quietly as she labeled his new rocks. Ethan felt something shift inside him every time she calmed one of the boys with ease. But he didn't know what to do with that feeling. It unnerved him, it humbled him, and slowly, it pulled him back toward the home he had abandoned. Meanwhile, Rosemary's days had become a careful balance of responsibilities she took on without hesitation. She managed the household chores, helped the boys navigate school assignments, and created little routines that gave them structure without pressure. She never forgot which sock drawer belonged to whom or which bedtime story calmed which child. But more importantly, she paid attention, truly paid attention to the boys in a way no one had in years. One Tuesday afternoon, after a rough test at school, Liam came home in a mood that would have derailed the entire evening months ago. He threw his backpack across the hallway and stormed down the corridor. Ethan, who happened to be home that day, tensed immediately, expecting chaos. Before he'd intervene, he saw Rosemary walk calmly toward Liam. She didn't raise her voice or try to reason with him. She simply handed him his sketch pad and motioned toward the balcony. Liam hesitated for a moment, then snatched the pad and stomped outside. Ethan watched the exchange from a distance, marveling at how effortlessly she diffused the storm. "What was that?" Ethan asked, surprised. Rosemary shrugged gently. "Liam doesn't like being asked to talk right away. He needs an outlet first. Once he draws, he can tell you what's bothering him." She spoke with a quiet confidence, the kind born from weeks of observing, learning, understanding. Ethan realized then that she knew his children better than he did. The thought didn't sting. It simply revealed a truth he could no longer avoid. Caleb had his own rituals with her. When his anxiety flared, he sought Rosemary with a desperation that Ethan once mistook for clinginess. But Rosemary saw it for what it was, a cry for steadiness. She taught him small grounding exercises and hummed songs that reminded her of Sunday mornings in Georgia. One night, Ethan passed by the living room and found Caleb curled beside her on the couch, resting his head on her shoulder while she read a book out loud. The sight hit him so deeply he had to step into another room to collect himself. No, though, remained the most mysterious. He followed Rosemary from room to room, not speaking, just observing. He brought her little objects he found on walk stones, acorns, colorful bits of string. Ethan once saw Rosemary kneel to thank No for a pebble he handed her. She placed it gently in the jar on the sill and said, "Everything you give me matters." No's face lit up with a warmth Ethan hadn't seen since Grace was alive. Something about that moment stuck with him long after he walked away. And yet, for all the subtle miracles happening within the penthos, Rosemary kept her humility. She never acted like she was fixing anything. She didn't take credit. She didn't boast. She moved with quiet purpose, treating each child with a type of tenderness that held no expectation of reward. But those small gestures created a ripple effect through the home, softening Ethan's edges and encouraging him to really try to rebuild what had fallen apart. Ethan began rearranging his schedule, reducing late flights, moving meetings to Zoom. His colleagues raised eyebrows, investors worried. But Ethan didn't care. He had missed enough. And every day he showed up, he saw more evidence of Rosemary's impact. The boys sat closer to her during meals. They sought her approval before making decisions. They laughed around her actual ladder that filled corners of the penthos that had gone untouched for years. It wasn't that Rosemary replaced Grace, no one could. but she became something essential, an anchor, a guide, a bridge back to the emotional world Ethan had abandoned. And as he watched her from across the penthouse each evening, leaning over the boys, listening to them, teaching them, nurturing them, he felt something grow in his chest. Something warm, something hopeful, something he thought he had buried with his wife. He didn't dare name it yet, but he knew this much: Rosemary Collins had changed everything. Ethan didn't intend to stop in front of the boys' room that night. He had only meant to walk past quickly, grab a file from his office, and head back to the airport for another late flight to San Diego. His suitcase was still open in his bedroom, half-packed. Shirts folded with the precision of a man who lived more in hotel rooms than in his own home. But as he stepped down the hallway, a faint sound drifted toward him, soft voices, small but steady. The unmistakable rhythm of his sons speaking words he hadn't heard from them in years. Something compelled him to pause, hand hovering in midair as though his body understood something his mind had not yet caught up to. He leaned closer to the partially opened door, and the scene inside hit him with such force it nearly buckled his knees. There they were again, Liam, Caleb, and Noah, kneeling on the carpet beside Rosemary, their hands tucked together, their faces calm, focused, full of trust. Rosemary sat with them, not towering over them like an adult issuing instructions, but kneeling as well, shoulder to shoulder, matching their height, matching their vulnerability. Her voice flowed with a gentle rhythm that made Ethan's chest ache. Even when life feels confusing, she murmured, "There is always a place you can speak your truth." The boys nodded, absorbing every word like it was nourishment. Liam spoke first, as he always did when he felt safe. "Thank you for helping me stay in control today," he whispered. "I didn't hit anyone, I didn't scream. Rosemary helped me breathe." Ethan brought a hand to his forehead, his breath catching in his throat. Liam's anger had been a constant concern: teachers calling, nannies quitting, administrators sending reports filled with red flags. Yet here he was, learning emotional control from a woman Ethan barely knew. Caleb followed. "Thank you for letting my tummy feel better," he said, voice trembling. "I didn't get scared this morning even when the train was loud." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the sting behind them grow sharper. He hadn't known about the train noise. He hadn't known it frightened Caleb. His son had faced his fears without him, leaning instead on Rosemary's steady presence. Then came no. He didn't speak, not with words, but he reached out and placed a tiny smooth pebble in Rosemary's hand, pressing it carefully into her palm. It was his way of expressing gratitude, something Ethan had come to understand over the past few weeks. Rosemary closed her fingers around the pebble, her voice soft with warmth. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said. "That means everything." Ethan felt a crack deep within him, a fracture that tore through the layers he'd constructed around his heart. He stepped back from the door, gripping the wall to keep himself upright. His chest tightened as a wave of emotion surged through him, raw, unfiltered, overwhelming. He hadn't expected to feel anything tonight. He had planned, as always, to disappear into work, allowing spreadsheets and negotiations to drown out the ache he carried. But no amount of work could compete with the sight of his children kneeling beside someone who had become their anchor. He moved away from the door, his steps unsteady, and slipped into the guest bathroom, the one Grace used to fill with lavender lotions and warm candles. The one that had once held her laughter bouncing off the walls whenever she spilled bathwater or hummed while brushing her hair. He turned on the faucet, letting the water run as he leaned over the sink, gripping the edges until his knuckles turned white. His reflection stared back at him, tired and hollow, a man who had buried his heart in deadlines and conference rooms, trying to outrun the grief that never stopped chasing him. Grace's voice echoed in his mind with aching clarity. She had always known how to reach him, even when he retreated deep into himself. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Ethan," she once whispered, mere days after the boys were born. "Sometimes the bravest thing is letting yourself feel." He had kissed her forehead and promised he would try. But after she died, feeling anything had become too dangerous, so he shut down. He focused on growth charts and stock options, convincing himself that providing financially was the same as being present. But standing there now, listening to the memory of her voice blending with the soft words Rosemary had spoken to the boys, he felt the truth settle over him with a weight he could no longer deny. His children needed more than money. They needed someone who showed up. Someone who held them when they cried, who guided them when they worried, who listened without judgment. Someone like Rosemary, someone Grace would have loved. He thought back to those early years of marriage, when he and Grace would walk through Central Park with the triplets strapped in strollers, laughing about their exhaustion, dreaming about their future. She used to say, "These boys will change the world someday, Ethan, but only if we are present enough to teach them how." He had nodded then, hopeful and optimistic. Now that memory felt like a promise he had broken. Tears finally fell not in sharp bursts, but in slow, heavy drops that trailed down his cheeks. He sank onto the edge of the tub, burying his face in his hands. It wasn't a breakdown. It was the release he had denied himself for too long. When he finally collected himself and stepped out of the bathroom, he found himself walking not toward his packed suitcase, but toward the living room. He canceled his flight without hesitation, ignoring the flood of messages from his assistant. When the boys and Rosemary finished their prayer and came out of the room, they found him sitting at the dining table. Still in his suit, eyes red but posture firm. Liam stopped in his tracks. "Dad," he asked, uncertain. "I'm staying," Ethan said simply. His voice didn't waver. "I'm here tonight." The boys exchanged glances, hopeful, startled, unsure whether to believe him. But Rosemary saw something different in his expression. Something sincere. Something vulnerable. Something that told her the man standing before her wasn't the same man she met 2 months ago. That night, Ethan sat with his sons through dinner, listening to every story, every complaint, every small victory. He wasn't polished. He wasn't flawless, but he was present, and for the first time in years, he felt like a father. Later, when Rosemary walked past the dining room, he caught her eye. "Thank you," he whispered. It wasn't gratitude for the prayer or the progress. It was gratitude for waking him up, for showing him what mattered, for being the bridge between the life he had and the life he wanted to rebuild. He didn't know what tomorrow would look like. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wasn't going to keep running. In the days that followed Ethan's emotional turning point, the Walker Penthos began to feel like a place where life actually existed again. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable changes that only someone paying close attention would have seen. But Rosemary noticed everything. She saw Ethan lingering in doorways a little longer, watching the boys play instead of rushing off to the next meeting. She saw him at the breakfast table more than once, coffee in hand, hair still damp from a rushed shower because he didn't want to miss the boys' morning chatter. She saw the boys glance at him frequently, as if checking whether he was truly there or if he would vanish again into another airport or hotel room. And each time they saw him still sitting beside them, a small spark lit in their eyes. Ethan was trying, really trying, and the effort showed. He wasn't polished at fatherhood, not yet. He burned pancakes twice. He tied Noah's shoes backward one morning. He packed Liam's lunch without realizing the boy hated peanut butter. He forgot to zip Caleb's jacket before school. But the boys did not complain. They grinned at each mistake, amused by this new version of their father who seemed both incredibly powerful and wildly clueless. They weren't used to a man who fumbled. They were used to a man who vanished. So every small error felt like a victory. One evening, Rosemary passed by the living room and froze when she heard laughter, not nervous laughter or forced politeness, but full, genuine laughter. Ethan was on the floor with the boys, building a lopsided Lego spaceship that made absolutely no architectural sense. Liam barked orders like a miniature commander. Caleb offered suggestions that contradicted Liam's every instruction. Noah sat quietly, piecing together a tiny ladder on the side of the ship that had no actual purpose. And Ethan was right there with them, nodding, adjusting, getting scolded for misplacing bricks, chuckling at their chaotic teamwork. Rosemary leaned against the wall, arms loosely crossed, observing the scene with an odd mixture of pride and caution. She had seen enough homes unravel to know that a few good days didn't guarantee stability. But she also couldn't ignore what was happening: a father rediscovering his children, 3 boys rediscovering safety, a household rediscovering warmth. Ethan noticed her watching and smiled, a soft, grateful smile that held weight. She returned a polite one, careful not to let it linger. She couldn't afford to read too much into his expression. He was vulnerable. He was healing. She was assisting that process, not meant to be part of it. But the truth was, Ethan had begun gravitating toward her presence in ways neither of them expected. He found himself stepping into the kitchen when she prepared breakfast, asking about the boys' habits or school progress. He asked her opinion more often. "Do you think Liam's angry at something specific? Is Caleb eating enough during the day? How can I encourage Noah to talk more?" She answered every question with genuine insight, impressed by his willingness to learn but careful to keep boundaries intact. And yet, even with those boundaries, there were moments she caught him watching her with a quiet curiosity, as if trying to understand how the heart of his entire household had ended up residing in a woman he barely knew. While the bond between Ethan and the boys grew, another force in the penthouse sensed the shift and disapproved of it entirely. Margaret Walker arrived unannounced on a crisp Tuesday afternoon, her heels clicking authoritatively on the marble floor before anyone even realized she was there. She entered the penthouse like she owned every inch of it, which, in many ways, she believed she did. Dressed in pearls and a fitted navy suit, she carried herself like a woman accustomed to control. Ethan greeted her with surprise. "Mom, I didn't know you were coming." I needed to see my grandsons, she replied coolly, though her sharp gaze immediately swept across the room, taking in every detail like a judge inspecting a courtroom. And to see what changes have been happening around here. Her tone wasn't light. Rosemary felt it instantly. She was wiping down the counter when Margaret's gaze landed on her. She didn't smile, she evaluated. Her expression was impeccably polite but lacked warmth entirely. "Miss Collins," she said with a curt nod. "I see you're still here." "Yes, ma'am," Rosemary replied softly, "just finishing up the afternoon tasks." Margaret looked her up and down as if searching for flaws under her simple attire and worn sneakers. "Good," she said. "Consistency is important for the boys. Though I'm sure your time here is temporary, it's pleasant to see you making yourself useful." Ethan stiffened. Rosemary simply nodded. Margaret moved closer to the living room where the boys were working on homework. She spent 10 minutes checking their posture, commenting on their handwriting, adjusting Caleb's collar, and correcting Liam's pencil grip. The boys tensed immediately. Ethan saw it, Margaret didn't. Eventually, Margaret pulled Ethan aside. "Something is happening in this household," she said, "and I'm not sure it's appropriate." Ethan frowned. "What are you talking about?" "You rehome more often," she said, as if it were an accusation. "Your schedule is changing, your priorities appear to be shifting, and the boys seem unusually attached to the maid." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Her name is Rosemary." Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "The title matters more than the name." Then, with a raised brow, she added, "You cannot allow someone in her position to gain too much influence over the boys. They need stability, structure, and guidance from their own family, not from hired help who may pack up and leave whenever it suits her." "She's done more for them than anyone else," Ethan replied firmly, a tone Margaret wasn't used to hearing, "including me." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Don't be naive, Ethan. Emotional dependence on staff is dangerous. It creates confusion. You have no idea what her intentions may be." "She's not manipulating them," Ethan shot back. "She's helping them." "And what are her motivations?" Margaret pressed. "Affection, sympathy, or something more self-serving?" Ethan's expression hardened. "She cares about them." Margaret's lips pursed. "There is caring, and then there is attachment that crosses boundaries. You would be wise to remember the difference." Rosemary didn't hear the conversation word for word, but she felt the tension in the air long after Margaret left. She watched Ethan pace near the balcony long after she tucked the boys into bed. She watched the boys cling closer to him, unsure why the atmosphere felt heavy. And she watched her own hands trembly as she cleaned up after dinner, wondering how long she could safely stay in a household where love was both desperately needed and heavily scrutinized. Ethan, conflicted and frustrated, found himself standing at the kitchen counter staring at the saplings on the balcony. They had grown small but alive, just like his sons, just like the possibility of something better. He whispered to himself, almost without realizing it, "She's good for them." And the truth hung in the room undeniable. What he didn't know yet was that Margaret Walker was far from finished, and her next move would change everything. Margaret Walker was not a woman who allowed potential threats, real or imagined, to linger in her world without intervention. The moment she sensed Rosemary's growing importance to the boys, her instincts sharpened. She had seen this pattern before in wealthy family staff, becoming too familiar, too loved, too irreplaceable. In Margaret's mind, such attachments destabilized the household, and anything that destabilized the household, even if rooted in compassion, was unacceptable. So she didn't wait long before taking matters into her own hands. The opportunity came one Wednesday afternoon. Ethan had stepped out for a rare in-person meeting, a quick one he promised would take no more than an hour. The boys were still at school. Rosemary was in the kitchen prepping snacks for when they returned: apple slices, carrot sticks, and a small tray of crackers arranged with care. She hummed lightly as she worked, unaware that Margaret had slipped quietly into the penthos with the subtlety of a hawk circling prey. "Miss Collins," Margaret announced from behind her. Rosemary jumped, nearly dropping the knife she was using. She turned quickly, offering a polite smile. "Mrs. Walker, I didn't know you were visiting today." Margaret set her handbag on the counter with deliberate precision, her posture erect, her expression unreadable. "I make it a point to check in on my grandchildren unexpectedly," she said. "I find that unannounced visits reveal more truth than scheduled ones." Rosemary wasn't sure how to respond, so she nodded and folded her hands gently in front of her. Margaret's gaze swept across the kitchen, then landed back on Rosemary. "You've been spending an extraordinary amount of time with the boys," she said, "and they appear have formed strong attachments to you." Rosemary's throat tightened. She took a small breath. "The boys are wonderful children. They've been through a lot. I'm just trying to support them." Margaret stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply on the tile. "Support is one thing, influence is another. I need to understand which one you believe you reoffering." Rosemary swallowed hard. She kept her voice even. "I'm here to help them feel safe, Mrs. Walker, that's all." Margaret's smile was thin, almost surgical. "Safety," she repeated. "Interesting choice of word. You seem to have forgotten that children from families like ours require boundaries. They cannot be allowed to rely on staff for emotional stability. It creates confusion and disrupts family hierarchy." Rosemary stiffened. She had heard similar sentiments before from other employers, lies wrapped in etiquette. But hearing it from someone connected so deeply to the boys hurt in a way she didn't expect. "With respect," Rosemary said gently, "they come to me because they're hurting. I just want to help." Margaret leaned in slightly. "And what happens when you leave?" Rosemary froze. Margaret's words hit deeper than intended, sending a tremor through her chest. What happens when you leave? It was the question Rosemary herself was too afraid to ask. She was temporary, she knew that. And yet the boys clung to her like she was permanent. That contradiction tore at her daily. "I don't plan on leaving them abruptly," Rosemary whispered. "But you will leave," Margaret replied. "People like you always do. Not because you were cruel, but because you don't belong in their long-term world. And the sooner you understand that, the less damage you will cause." Rosemary's eyes burned, but she held her composure. She wasn't going to let Margaret see her falter. "I'm doing my best, ma'am." "Your best is not the issue," Margaret said. "Your presence is. You must keep your distance. Emotional boundaries are essential for staff. You are crossing lines you may not even be aware of." Rosemary felt something inside her drop, like a stone sinking to the bottom of a river. She wasn't crossing lines intentionally. She wasn't seeking affection. She wasn't even trying to be special. The boys came to her because they were lost. She stayed with them because someone had to. But Margaret twisted that into something inappropriate, something dangerous. "I understand," Rosemary said quietly, even though she didn't. Margaret studied her for a moment, then reached out to just a piece of imaginary lint from Rosemary's sleeve. "Good," she said. "You seem like a sensible young woman. Do not mistake kindness for belonging. These boys will have many people come and go in their lives. They need consistency, structure, and guidance from their family, not from someone hired to wipe counters and fold blankets." The words struck disproportionately hard. Not because Rosemary believed them, but because they tapped directly into her deepest insecurity that she was replaceable, disposable, forgettable. She nodded once, unable to trust her voice. Margaret gave a satisfied nod, retrieved her handbag, and strode toward the door. "I trust you'll be more mindful moving forward," she said as she left. When the door closed, Rosemary leaned against the kitchen island, gripping the edge as if anchoring herself to the room. Her chest ached. She blinked several times, forcing back the tears that threatened to rise. She had faced difficult employers before, cruel ones even. But this felt different. This wasn't about pride or ego. This was about the boys' 3 small hearts who had placed their trust in her. And Margaret had implied that trust was dangerous. When the boys came home, they noticed something different instantly. Liam frowned and tugged at her sleeve. "You okay?" She forced a smile, crouched to his height, and brushed his hair back. "Of course, sweetheart," she said. "Just a long day." Caleb stared at her longer than usual, sensing something wasn't right. No placed a small rock in her hand, a gesture he used only when he felt someone needed comfort. Rosemary held the rock tightly in her fist. She kept her smile steady. She didn't want them to feel the shift happening inside her, the seed of doubt Margaret had planted. Later that evening, Ethan arrived home sooner than expected. He found Rosemary organizing the boys' backpacks with unusual stiffness in her shoulders. "Everything okay?" he asked. She nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Yes, just getting things ready for tomorrow." Ethan watched her closely. Something felt off. Her voice lacked its usual warmth. Her eyes looked tired. Her smile wasn't real. But Rosemary didn't offer details, and Ethan didn't press, not yet. He didn't know Margaret had been there. He didn't know the conversation had carved fear into Rosemary's heart. And he didn't know that a storm was coming, one that would test every fragile connection in their home. For now, he simply walked toward the hallway to greet his sons, unaware that the moment he left the kitchen, Rosemary exhaled shakily, steadying herself with both hands against the counter. She had no idea what to do next. Margaret Walker did not believe in leaving loose ends. Her first conversation with Rosemary had satisfied her momentarily, but the more she observed Ethan's household from a distance, the boys' softened behavior, Ethan's newfound presence, the subtle warmth growing in the penthouse, the more she felt a tightening in her chest. It reminded her uncomfortably of the one thing she couldn't control: emotional attachments. She understood finances, reputations, and public image. She even understood grief, though she never allowed herself to express it openly. What she didn't understand was how a young woman with no pedigree, no degrees, and no social standing could slip so effortlessly into the most vulnerable spaces of her family. She decided a second conversation was necessary, this time away from the penthouse, Away from Ethan's eyes, away from the boys' potential interruptions. Something more decisive, something conclusive. So she called Rosemary directly. Her voice on the phone was crisp and commanding. "Miss Collins, I'd like to speak with you privately. Lunch at the Fairmont Hotel tomorrow at noon. I trust you'll be punctual." It wasn't a request, it wasn't even an invitation. It was a directive, the kind wealthy matriarchs like Margaret delivered with the assumption that obedience was guaranteed. Rosemary almost declined. Every instinct in her body told her this wasn't something she should agree to. But refusing felt disrespectful, and she didn't want to cause conflict that would affect the boys. So she swallowed her apprehension and said softly, "Yes, ma'am, I'll be there." The next day, she arrived at the Fairmont wearing her best blouse, simple, clean, slightly faded at the seams. The lobby's grandeur overwhelmed her instantly, towering marble columns, golden chandeliers, staff gliding by with perfect posture. Everything felt polished, expensive, deliberate. Rosemary felt acutely out of place, but she steadied herself before stepping into the restaurant. Margaret was already seated at a corner table overlooking the city, sipping tea with a pose that radiated authority. She didn't stand to greet Rosemary. She simply gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." Rosemary did. Margaret studied her for a long moment, eyes sharp, calculating as if assessing not just her appearance but the entirety of her worth. "I appreciate punctuality," Margaret said at last. "It's a quality many people lack these days." "Thank you," Rosemary replied quietly. "I asked you here," Margaret continued, "because I believe in dealing with matters directly." And this she motioned vaguely, as if referring to the entire Walker household, has become a matter. Rosemary folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "I'm not sure I understand what you understand perfectly." Margaret's interruption was smooth, cold. "The boys are growing attached to you. My son is beginning to lean on your presence more than he realizes. And while your intentions may be pure, the consequences of this dynamic are far from simple." Rosemary swallowed hard. "I care about them," she said, "all of them." "That is precisely the problem." Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She placed it on the table with a flawless manicure and slid it toward Rosemary. "Open it." Rosemary's heart thudded. She hesitated, then slowly lifted the flap. Inside was a check, a large one. Larger than anything she had ever held in her life. $500,000. Her breath hitched. She stared at the number, the ink, the signature, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. "That," Margaret said, "is enough to start fresh. A new home, a new job, perhaps even a new town, something stable for someone like you. Consider it a gesture of gratitude for your help during a difficult time." Rosemary blinked rapidly, trying to clear the sudden sting in her eyes. "Mrs. Walker, why are you doing this?" "Because you have overstepped," Margaret said plainly. "You have entangled yourself emotionally in matters you were never meant to be part of. You are an employee, not family, not a second mother, not a partner for my son." Rosemary felt her throat tighten painfully. "I never tried to be any of those things." "Intentions are irrelevant," Margaret said. "Impact is what matters, and your impact has grown far beyond what is appropriate." Rosemary looked down at the check again. $500,000, money that could change her entire life. Money she could never dream of earning in years of work. Money that could help her mother, her future, her stability. But the thought of leaving the boys, of walking out on them, of letting them wake up without her there, of breaking their trust hit her like a punch to the gut. Liam's angry but fragile heart, Caleb's nervous hands, Noah's quiet gestures. She pictured their faces and felt her chest twist. "No," she whispered. Margaret froze. "Excuse me. I can't take this," Rosemary said, voice trembling. "I didn't come for money. I stayed for the boys, because they needed someone." Margaret leaned forward, eyes glinting with ice. "They need stability. And that stability does not come from a temporary maid who might bolt the moment life becomes inconvenient." "I wouldn't just leave," Rosemary insisted. "You say that now." Margaret's tone cut like a blade. "But I know your type. You get attached, you get overwhelmed. And then you disappear." Her voice sharpened. "My grandchildren do not deserve to be abandoned again." The word abandoned sliced through Rosemary, leaving her breathless. She had grown up with her own history of inconsistency, relatives who drifted in and out of her life, friends who vanished when circumstances got hard. She had spent years promising herself she would never do that to anyone. But hearing the accusation from Margaret shook her deeply. What if she did hurt the boys? What if loving them this much meant breaking them later? What if she wasn't enough? Margaret saw the conflict in her eyes and pressed harder. "Do the right thing, Miss Collins. Take the check, leave with dignity. Don't drag this out until it causes more harm." Rosemary stared down at her lap, her pulse pounding, her thoughts spiraling. A part of her wanted to stand up, leave the restaurant, and never look back. Another part wanted to run back to the penthouse and cling to the boys, promising them she would never walk away. But she wasn't Navy, she knew she wasn't family. She knew people like Margaret held more influence than she ever could, and suddenly the weight of that disparity crushed her. Margaret stood, smoothing her blazer. "You have time to think," she said calmly, "but don't wait too long. Emotional damage grows quickly." With that, she left, her heels going sharply against the marble floor. Rosemary sat alone at the table for nearly 15 minutes before finally rising. She tucked the envelope back into her bag, not because she wanted the money, but because she was too shaken to decide what to do with it yet. She walked out of the hotel with trembling hands, her mind fractured between love and fear, belonging and boundaries, duty and heartbreak. She didn't know it yet, but Margaret's words would haunt her that night, echoing louder than any reassurance she tried to offer herself. And by dawn, she would make a decision she never wanted to make. Rosemary barely slept the night after her meeting with Margaret. She lay awake in the small guest room the Walkers had given her, staring at the ceiling as countless thoughts drifted in and out of her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, the boys' faces resurfaced: Liam's fierce determination, Caleb's trembling vulnerability, Noah's quiet devotion. She saw the way they clung to her hands, the way their shoulders relaxed when she reassured them, the way they sought her out when the world felt too heavy. And then she heard Margaret's voice again, sharp and unforgiving, echoing the very fear Rosemary had tried to ignore: "What happens when you leave?" Those words burrowed into her chest like thorns. She wasn't family. She wasn't bound to them by anything permanent. One day something would happen, she'd need to move, or the agency would reassign her, or Ethan's life would change, and then the boys would be left with the hole she created. She had promised herself once, years ago, that she would never be the cause of someone's heartbreak. But now she feared she already was. Just before dawn, Rosemary slipped quietly from her bed and sat at the small desk beside the window overlooking Central Park. The early morning haze rested over the city like a thin blanket. She stared at 3 blank note cards for a long time before picking up her pen. Her hands shook as she began writing. For Liam, she wrote, "You are stronger than your anger. You can build anything with those hands of yours. Keep drawing, don't forget to breathe. I will always be proud of you." For Caleb, she wrote, "You feel deeply because your heart is so big. Be patient with yourself. Your courage grows a little every day. Take care of your tummy. It's okay to be scared, and it's okay to ask for help." For Noah, the one who rarely used words, she wrote it. "Thank you for the treasures you gave me. Every one of them meant more than you know. Keep collecting beautiful things. You give meaning to the world in your own way. I believe in you." She signed each note with a small heart, not out of romance or sentimentality, but because she knew the boys understood symbols better than long explanations. She folded the cards and placed them carefully on each pillow, smoothing the blankets one last time. She packed a small bag, just the essentials: her notebook, her spare clothes, the jar of nose stones that she couldn't bring herself to leave behind. She looked around the room that had become a sanctuary of sorts. It held the warmth she brought into it, the energy of the children who ran in and out each afternoon to hug her or show her something new. Leaving felt like tearing herself away from a home she never expected to find. Around 6 in the morning, she took one last walk through the penthouse. She lingered in the hallway where the boys' drawings still hung crookily on the wall. She brushed her fingertips over a painting Liam had proudly taped there the week before, an abstract mess of colors that he insisted represented hope. She paused in the kitchen, where the smell of yesterday's cinnamon oatmeal still clung faintly to the air. She peeked onto the balcony, where 3 small saplings stood tall for their age, their leaves catching the soft morning breeze. Her chest tightened painfully as she whispered, "Grow well." Then she grabbed her bag, opened the front door, and slipped out before the world had woken. The house didn't feel different right away. Stillness covered everything like a thin mist, too subtle to notice until someone looked closely. Ethan expected to find Rosemary in the kitchen when he woke. He expected to hear the soft clink of dishes, the quiet rhythm of her movements, the gentle hum she always carried. But when he walked downstairs, a strange emptiness greeted him instead. The counters were spotless, the sink was dry, the air lacked its usual morning warmth. He frowned. "Rosemary." No answer. He checked the pantry, then the laundry room, then the balcony. Nothing. The boys woke minutes later and ran into the living room, expecting to see her waiting with breakfast. They froze when they didn't find her. Liam scowled. "Where is she?" Caleb bit his lip, clutching his stomach. Noah wandered toward the hallway with a worried crease in his brow. Then Caleb spotted something on his pillow when he returned to his room. "Dad," he called, voice thin. "There's something here." Ethan stepped in and his stomach dropped when he saw the folded note. He picked it up with trembling fingers. As he read, his heart sank deeper with every word. He rushed to the other rooms. Liam's note. Noah's note. all carrying the same final message of love, regret, and the unmistakable H of goodbye. What do they mean? Liam demanded, voice cracking. Why would she write this? Caleb clung to Ethan's leg. She said she'd stay. His voice broke on the last word. No stood still at the end of the hallway, holding his note like a fragile leaf, his shoulders hunched inward. His rock jar sat on the floor beside him, empty now except for the objects he had placed there over the weeks. He picked up one stone and pressed it to his chest, as if trying to keep something from breaking. Liam's fury came first. He grabbed his backpack and hurled it at the wall. This is stupid. He shouted, she lied. She like everyone else. Caleb slid to the floor, clutching his stomach with both hands. It hurts, he whimpered. It hurts again. No didn't speak. His face crumpled, and he stepped backward until he hit the wall, then slid down it with tears streaming silently down his cheeks. He pressed the stone tighter against himself. Ethan felt the world tilt. He had never seen his sons fall apart like this, not even after Grace died. This was a different kind of heartbreak, a fresh wound layered on top of an old one. He gathered them close, but his arms felt inadequate. Liam fought against his embrace. Caleb sobbed into his shirt. No simply collapsed into his lap, shaking. And Ethan realized with devastating clarity how deeply Rosemary had become woven into the fabric of their lives. When the boys finally cried themselves into exhaustion, Ethan tucked them onto the couch and stepped into the hallway. He ran a hand over his face, his breath unsteady. He didn't know where Rosemary had gone. He didn't know why she had left, but he knew two things with absolute certainty. His sons needed her. And so did he. He marched toward his mother's guest room with fury brewing behind his ribs. He had no proof yet, no concrete evidence, but something in his gut twisted with suspicion. Margaret had been too invested in undermining Rosemary, too involved, too controlling. He knocked once, no answer. He turned the handle and stepped inside. Margaret sat at her vanity, adjusting her earrings. She looked at him in the mirror, calm and composed. You did this, Ethan said, voice low but shaking. She didn't flinch. I protected this family. Ethan's jaw clenched, his vision burned. You tore them apart. But Margaret didn't believe she'd done anything wrong. And Rosemary, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart, was already miles away, believing she had made the only choice she could. The boys felt abandoned, Ethan felt betrayed, and the home that had just begun healing felt raw and fractured again. And somewhere on a train out of New York, Rosemary pressed her forehead to the window and whispered, I'm sorry, praying the boys would somehow forgive her one day. The morning after Rosemary's departure was a blur for Ethan Walker, but not in the usual way that work or meetings overwhelmed him. It was the kind of blur that came from heartbreak rippling through a home that had barely begun to mend. The boys were quieter, though not calm, each dealing with the emotional wreckage in their own way. Liam moved through the penthouse with restless frustration, unable to focus on anything, snapping at his brothers without meaning to. Caleb kept clutching his stomach as if trying to hold himself together from the inside. No carried Rosemary's note everywhere, folded and unfolded until the edges frayed, as if it were the last piece of her he could cling to. Ethan watched them with a sinking realization this wasn't something time alone could fix. They had already suffered the loss of their mother. Losing Rosemary felt like losing the one person who had helped them breathe again. He couldn't sit back and let that wound fester. He couldn't repeat the mistake of detachment, not when the cost was this high. So for the first time in years, he cleared his entire schedule, canceled flights, postponed meetings, refused to take calls. His assistant panicked. Investors demanded answers. But he didn't care. His children needed him more than the board ever would. He gathered the boys in the living room. We going to find her, he said simply. The room froze. Liam's head snapped toward him, eyes wide with disbelief. Caleb blinked through tears. No clutched his note tightly as if afraid Ethan might disappear before finishing the sentence. What do you mean? Liam asked, voice shaky. I mean, we're going to Georgia, Ethan said. We're going to bring Rosemary home. Caleb gasped softly. No took a step forward, as if pulled by hope. Ethan knelt before them. I made the mistake of being absent once, he said. I won't make it again. Not when someone who matters this much is missing. Within hours, Ethan had packed bags, loaded snacks, water bottles, and the boys' favorite blankets into his SUV. He could have taken a private jet, but something about this journey, this choice felt like it needed to be grounded, tangible, human. A road trip from New York to Georgia, 13 hours of highways, rest stops, and raw conversations. It felt right. As they pulled out of the parking garage, Caleb leaned against his seat with a fragile kind of trust. No held his stone jar in his lap. Liam watched the city skyline retreat in the rearview mirror, jaw tight but eyes hopeful. The first few hours passed in tense quiet. The boys weren't ready to talk. They were processing too much. Ethan kept the radio low, glancing at them occasionally but not pushing. They needed time. and he was finally ready to give it to them. Eventually, somewhere past Baltimore, Liam broke the silence not with anger, but with confusion. Why did she leave us? Ethan answered honestly, even though the truth hurt. Because someone made her think she didn't belong. Did you make her think that? Liam demanded. Ethan's chest tightened. No. But I should have protected her better. I should have made sure she knew she was important to this family. Kay sniffed. Is she mad at us? No, Ethan said firmly. She loves you, that's why she left. That doesn't make sense, Liam muttered. Ethan glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Sometimes when people care too much, they get scared. They're afraid they'll hurt the people they love. I think Rosemary was scared of that. Liam nodded slightly, understanding more than his 8 years should have allowed. A few more miles passed before Caleb whispered, do you think Sheila want to come back? Ethan took a steady breath. I don't know. But we were going to tell her how much she means to us. We were going to tell her the truth. And whatever happens, she won't have to guess anymore. Caleb leaned back, holding on to that thought as if it were the first piece of hope he'd had since she left. Later, as they crossed into North Carolina, Noah finally spoke a single, small word, home. Ethan's heart lurched. It had been weeks since Noah said anything beyond a whisper. He reached back and took Noah's hand for a moment while driving. Yes, Ethan said softly, we were going to find home again. They stopped at a rest area for lunch. The boys huddled together at a picnic table, eating peanut butter sandwiches Ethan had packed poorly. Liam joked about the crusts being sideways. Caleb giggled about the squished grape jelly. Noah offered Ethan a small pebble he found near the parking lot, a gesture with enormous meaning. Ethan kept it in his palm for a moment, feeling the weight of what that tiny stone represented: trust, healing, connection. Back on the road, Ethan allowed himself to reflect. He realized how much he had relied on Rosemary, not just as an employee, but as the emotional anchor of the household. He remembered Grace telling him once, someday someone will come into our children's lives who helps them grow in ways we can't. Don't fight it, welcome it. At the time, he thought she meant teachers or coaches. Now he realized she had meant someone like Rosemary, kind, grounded, intuitive, and brave. The boys eventually drifted to sleep, their heads leaning on each other. Ethan glanced at them, the ache in his chest deepening. He spoke softly as if Grace could hear him. I'm trying, he whispered. I'm doing this right this time. By late afternoon, the Georgia border sign appeared, and the boys woke one by one. Liam pressed his forehead to the window. Caleb sat up straighter. Noah clutched his jar with renewed energy. We were close, Ethan told them. They arrived in Augusta just as the sun dipped low, painting the sky gold. Ethan parked near the small street where Rosemary's mother lived, following the address he found in Rosemary's employee file. The boys were buzzing with emotion, nervous, hopeful, scared. Are we going to knock? Caleb asked. No, Ethan said. We were going to find her the way she finds peace. He knew where she'd be. The boys did too. The little church down the road, white wooden doors, a bell tower, and the familiar glow of evening mass. They had heard her talk about it often, about how she used to sit there when life grew heavy. Ethan took their hands as they walked toward the church's soft light. And inside, just as he hoped, Rosemary was kneeling in a pew near the front, head bowed. Her shoulders trembled slightly, as if she'd been crying. The boys saw her first. Rosemary, Caleb cried. Her head snapped up, her breath caught. And the world changed again. Rosemary's breath caught before she even turned fully toward the sound of her name. She recognized Caleb's voice instantly, high, trembling, desperate. It sliced through her heart with the accuracy of something she had tried and failed to outrun. She spun around, and the moment her eyes landed on the 3 boys rushing down the aisle toward her, she froze in place. For one suspended heartbeat, she believed she must be dreaming. But then Liam collided with her first, arms wrapping fiercely around her waist, followed by Caleb burying his face into her shoulder. And Noah clinging to the sleeve of her shirt as if holding her would anchor the entire world. Her knees buckled under the weight of their emotions. She sank to the wooden floor of the church, arms enveloping the boys with a fragile mix of relief and disbelief. Their sobs came without hesitation, raw, broken, filled with every ounce of hurt they had been carrying since she left. Caleb's fists clutched her shirt. Liam's breathing came in uneven bursts. Noah pressed his forehead to her chest, gripping her tightly. Their small bodies trembled, and Rosemary held them as if letting go would steal her oxygen. I'm so sorry, she whispered into their hair. I shouldn't have left like that. I thought it was the right thing. I thought I was protecting you. Her voice cracked with every word. I was wrong. Liam was the first to lean back, his face streaked with tears and frustration. Don't ever do that again, he said fiercely, punching her arm with all the power of a child trying to hide how devastated he'd been. You can't leave us like that. You can't. Rosemary cupped his cheek with a trembling hand. I won't, she whispered. Not ever again. Caleb sobbed harder, pressing himself closer to her. I kept waiting for you, he said. I woke up and you were gone. No didn't speak. He simply crawled into her lap, arms winding around her neck. He placed a small stone into her hand, a polished white one he'd been gripping since they'd left the car. It was smooth, warm, and trembling in her palm. Rosemary's breath hitched. Noah had saved that stone for her, carried it the entire journey. She clasped it to her heart, overwhelmed. She lifted her eyes then, and Ethan stood in the aisle still tense, his expression torn between relief and anguish. He looked like a man holding his breath after years of not knowing how to breathe at all. When she met his gaze, something inside him cracked open. He took a slow step toward her, then another. Her heart pounded painfully. She hadn't expected him here, hadn't expected the boys, certainly not Ethan. And seeing him now with exhaustion carved into his face and determination burning in his eyes, she realized just how deeply her absence had affected him too. He stopped a few feet away, as if giving her space to choose whether to meet him. His voice was low, rough. You leaving nearly destroyed them, he said, and it nearly destroyed me. Rosemary flinched. I never meant to hurt anyone, she whispered. I thought your mother said she convinced me that my presence would do more harm than good. Ethan's jaw tightened. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, steadying himself. My mother had no right, he said. She acted out of fear and control, not truth. I should have protected you from that. Her eyes filled again, this time not from pain alone, but from the shock of hearing someone defend her really defend her. I'm sorry, Ethan continued, stepping closer. I should have made it clear from the start that you are part of this family. Not temporary. Not replaceable. His voice wavered. You matter to them. And to me. The boys clung tighter at those words. Rosemary's breath caught in her throat. Before she could respond, the church door creaked open. Margaret Walker stepped inside, her posture stiff, her expression composed but not cold. Not today. She scanned the room, eyes landing on Rosemary, the boys, then Ethan. Something in her face softened, a rare crack in her polished exterior. She approached slowly, each step measured, almost hesitant. For the first time since Rosemary had met her, Margaret looked unsure. When she reached the pew where they stood, she stopped several feet away. Her gaze dropped to Caleb wrapped around Rosemary, then to Noah's trembling hands, then to Liam's tear-streaked cheeks. The damage was undeniable, and she had caused it. Margaret swallowed the motion rigid. I didn't understand, she said quietly, voice lacking its usual steel. I thought I was protecting my family, but instead I caused pain I never intended. Her eyes lifted to Rosemary's, unexpectedly earnest. You cared for them when the rest of us failed to step forward. I see that now. Rosemary's lips parted, stunned. Margaret Walker apologizing. Margaret clasped her gloved hands. I am truly sorry for my actions, she said. I hope someday you'll forgive me. Rosemary blinked hard, overwhelmed. She hadn't expected remorse. She hadn't expected humility. She didn't know what to say. Ethan stepped beside Rosemary, placing a hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture both supportive and protective. Mom understands now, he said quietly. But you are the one who chooses what happens next. Rosemary looked at the boys first. Their faces were red, wet, desperate with hope. They clung to her like she was the last tether to stability they had left. Then she looked at Ethan. His eyes held everything: gratitude, regret, longing, fear, and something deeper he wasn't quite ready to name but couldn't hide anymore. Her voice was barely a whisper. I want to come home. Caleb gasped. Liam exhaled dramatically. Noah hugged her tighter. Ethan closed his eyes, relief washing over him like a tidal wave. And this time, Rosemary continued, brushing a tear off Liam's cheek. I'm staying. Ethan sank onto the pew beside them, pulling all four of them into an embrace. It wasn't perfect, arms tangled, shoulders bumping, tears still falling, but it felt whole, it felt right. For the first time in a long time, it felt like a family choosing each other fully. Margaret watched quietly, her expression softening further. She rested a hand over her heart, an uncharacteristic gesture, and nodded, as if accepting a truth she could no longer fight. As the church lights glowed warmly around them, Rosemary leaned her forehead against Ethan's shoulder, his hand steady against her back. The boys pressed closer, their breathing slowing as the storm inside them finally eased. They had all broken. They had all healed. And now together they were choosing a future built not on fear or control, but on courage, forgiveness, and love. The drive back to New York felt entirely different from the desperate 13-hour journey that had brought them to Georgia. This time the air inside the SUV carried relief instead of dread, hope instead of panic. Rosemary sat in the back seat between Caleb and Noah, their small bodies pressed tightly against her sides. Liam sat in the front passenger seat, turning around every few minutes just to make sure she was still there. Every time he saw her, he relaxed slightly, like a nervous heartbeat learning to slow. Ethan kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching the three of them. The sight of Rosemary whispering to no or brushing Caleb's hair or smiling softly as Liam asked her questions made something in him settle. For weeks he had lived in emotional chaos, torn between guilt, grief, and fear of losing the people who mattered most. Now, seeing his children nestled against the woman who had brought them back to life, he knew this was the beginning of something far more profound than he'd expected. When they reached Manhattan, the city lights reflected in Rosemary's eyes. She hadn't expected to ever return to the penthouse. She'd left believing it was the only way to protect the boys and herself from pain. Now she stepped out of the SUV hesitantly, the towering building suddenly intimidating again. But the boys weren't having it. Liam grabbed her hand. Caleb clung to her coat. No pressed into her side as if anchoring himself. Ethan watched this quietly, then stepped behind them, gently touching the small of her back. "Let's go home," he said. The word home hit her with unexpected warmth. Inside the penthouse, the boys went straight to work undoing her absence. They pulled her to the kitchen, showing her the pictures they'd drawn since she left, the Lego spaceship they finished with Ethan, the saplings on the balcony that had grown new leaves during the days she was gone. Liam dragged her to his room to show her a drawing he'd made of the road trip. Caleb showed her a little notebook where he'd drawn stomach faces, sad ones for when it hurt, happy ones for when she was around. No placed another stone in her hand, a warm, golden, colored pebble he had saved during the drive back. Rosemary was overwhelmed, but she kept smiling, hugging them, listening with all her heart. Ethan stood in the doorway of the hallway, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a kind of awe that made him look younger, lighter, more grounded. Later that evening, Margaret arrived. She rang the doorbell instead of entering with her usual confidence, as if acknowledging that the penthouse was no longer a realm she commanded unchallenged. When Ethan opened the door, Rosemary stiffened automatically, her breath catching. But Margaret didn't sweep past them or deliver orders. Instead, she walked in slowly, hands clasped together, her posture less rigid and far more human than before. She approached the boys first, kneeling so she could meet their eyes. "I need to apologize to all of you," she said. Liam crossed his arms defensively. Caleb tucked behind Rosemary, stared at her warily. Margaret took a breath. "I was wrong. I made decisions that hurt you and hurt someone who's been good to you. I'm sorry." The boys didn't respond right away, but something in the room shifted. Their bodies eased, not fully, not completely, but enough. Margaret turned to Rosemary next. Her gaze carried genuine remorse. "I misjudged you," she said. "You gave my grandchildren a sense of peace none of us managed to provide. I hope one day you will forgive me." Rosemary wasn't naive enough to think that Margaret's apology erased everything, but she nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Walker," she replied softly. "I accept your apology." Margaret exhaled shakily as if relieved, then stood and stepped back, giving the family space. It was the first time she'd ever seemed small, not because of weakness, but because she finally understood her limits. That night, the boys refused to let Rosemary sleep in the guest room. They dragged their blankets to the hallway, insisting on sleeping beside her bedroom door just in case she leaves again. Rosemary's heart broke all over again, but Ethan stepped forward gently. "She's not going anywhere," he said. "Let's help her settle in properly." He led her to a different room, the one that had once been used for visiting relatives. "If you want something more comfortable, something more yours," he said, "this could be it." She blinked. "This is too much." "It's not," Ethan said, voice soft but firm. "You not staying as staff, you staying as someone we care about." Rosemary's breath hitched. He didn't say family or partner or anything that could scare her away, but he said enough. Enough to make her chest warm, enough to make her nod and accept the room. Over the next few days, trust rebuilding became a delicate dance. Liam shadowed her constantly, checking that she wasn't packing bags or avoiding eye contact. He hovered at the doorway when she cleaned, listened for her footsteps down the hall, and finally confessed one night during dinner, "When you left, it felt like everything stopped." Rosemary hugged him tightly. "I'm here now," she whispered, "and I'm staying." Caleb slowly relaxed too, though his stomach took longer to settle. He asked repeatedly if Ethan or Rosemary was picking him up from school. He drew pictures of the family again, this time with Rosemary firmly standing beside them. His trust grew through small acts, her helping with homework, cutting his apples the exact way he liked, rubbing his back when old anxieties resurfaced. No clung to her most, his quiet clinginess speaking volumes. He slept with her goodbye note under his pillow, even though she was back. He added stones to her jar daily, sometimes multiple at a time. And whenever she walked into the room, his face brightened in that soft, subtle way only No could express. And Ethan, he became the quiet backbone of this healing. He supported Rosemary without overwhelming her. He thanked her openly, defended her when necessary, and showed his sons through action that she wasn't an employee, they were choosing her. One evening he found her on the balcony watering the saplings. He stepped beside her, close but not too close. "You came back," he said. She looked up at him. "You came for me." He nodded, emotion rippling under his calm tone. "We will do it right this time. No more running, no more fear. We'll build something steady together." Rosemary felt something deep within her settle. For the first time, she believed it. The penthouse wasn't just a job anymore. It wasn't a temporary placement or a household she served. It was a place she could grow roots. And as she watched the boys race across the living room, Ethan smiling at her from the doorway, and Margaret offering a tentative but genuine nod from the kitchen, Rosemary realized she wasn't just returning, she was finally being welcomed home. Snow fell over Manhattan on Christmas Eve, the kind of slow, gentle snowfall that made the entire city feel like a snow globe someone had shaken with care. The Walker penthouse glowed with warm light, its windows framed by soft white drapes and garlands decorated by 3 enthusiastic boys and one very patient woman who kept pretending not to notice how unevenly the ornaments hung. Rosemary stood on a small ladder, adjusting a ribbon on the tree while the boys hopped around beneath her like excited puppies. Liam argued that the star should be tilted to the left. Caleb insisted it needed to face the balcony for better Christmas energy. No simply watched, holding a gold ornament shaped like a little angel, waiting for her gentle nod to place it somewhere meaningful. Ethan stood a short distance away, arms crossed, watching the scene with a full heart. He had seen many versions of Christmas over the years: lavish corporate parties, charity events, curated displays in luxury hotels, but none had ever felt like this. None had ever felt like a home filled with laughter, warmth, and people he loved. He couldn't take his eyes off Rosemary, her hair tied loosely with a red ribbon one of the boys had insisted she wear. Her cheeks dusted pink from climbing up and down the ladder. She was radiant in the simplest way, effortlessly, naturally, the way someone looks when they belong somewhere completely. And she belonged here. He knew it now with absolute certainty. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the velvet box he had been carrying for weeks. The timing had never felt right, too much healing left to do, too many fragile emotions settling into place. But tonight was different. Tonight felt earned. Tonight felt like the beginning of something their fractured family had been crawling toward together. Around 6 o'clock, the boys helped him move the furniture just enough to clear space near the balcony doors. Rosemary wasn't suspicious. She thought they were prepping for their annual cookie decorating competition, something Ethan had pretended to be terrible at just to make the boys laugh. But this time the nervous energy vibrated off them like static. Caleb checking his pocket, Liam kept pacing. No kept glancing at Ethan for reassurance, clutching a folded piece of paper he'd drawn earlier. "Should I start the hot cocoa?" Rosemary called from the kitchen. Ethan exchanged a glance with the boys. "Lie mouth now!" He stepped into the kitchen doorway. "Actually, could you come here for a second?" Rosemary turned, wiping flour from her hands. "What happened? Did someone spill something?" "Not yet," Liam muttered, barely containing his grin. Ethan smiled nervously. "No spills, just come here." She walked toward him, confusion knitting her brows. The boys scrambled behind her, trying and failing to act casual. Caleb hid his hand. No tucked his drawing behind his back. Liam adjusted the collar of his sweater like he was about to attend a wedding rather than watch his dad propose. When she stepped into the living room, she froze. Ethan had strung fairy lights across the balcony windows, each one glowing warmly, reflecting off the fresh snowfall outside. The saplings on the balcony, hers and the boys, were decorated with tiny bows and ornaments. The boys had taken great care, carefully hanging them earlier, whispering secrets about Dad's big plan. Under the lights, in the center of the room, lay a small blanket surrounded by candles. A simple but heartfelt setup that felt more intimate than anything grand or extravagant. Rosemary pressed a hand to her chest. "What is all this?" Liam stepped forward, clearing his throat dramatically. "This is important." Caleb nodded vigorously. Really important." No handed her the folded drawing. She opened it to find a picture of all 5 of them: Ethan, Rosemary, and the 3 boys holding hands beneath a Christmas tree. Above the scene, No had written a single word in shaky letters. "Family." Rosemary's breath caught. Ethan stepped closer, his heart hammering. He had never been more certain of anything, yet he'd never been more nervous. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet box. "Rosemary," he began softly. Her eyes widened, her hand flew to her mouth. "Ethan." He shook his head gently. "Let me say this." The boys stood behind him, fidgeting, eyes gleaming. "When you came into our lives, we were lost," he said. "The boys were hurting, I was drowning. The house looked perfect, but it wasn't alive. And then you arrived and brought warmth, patience, compassion, everything we didn't know we were missing." Her eyes filled instantly. "You healed my sons in ways I couldn't," Ethan continued. "You taught them to trust again. You taught them to hope again. And somewhere along the way you healed me too. Her tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't look away. I know we didn't get here easily. We've stumbled. We've broken. We put pieces back together one painful step at a time. But every moment of that journey led to this. He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring, a small diamond flanked by 2 tiny emeralds, the boys' birthstones. Liam whispered loudly, Dad designed it himself. Caleb oboed him, let him finish. Ethan smiled softly, eyes never leaving Rosemary's. This isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other every day, through every challenge. His voice thickened. Rosemary Collins, I love you. The boys love you. You are part of us. Will you marry me and help me build the family we've all been praying for? She gasped softly, covering her trembling lips. Her knees weakened, and Ethan stepped closer instinctively. She shook her head, not in refusal but in disbelief, and whispered, Yes, yes, Ethan, I will. The boys erupted instantly. Liam threw his hands up. She said yes. Kayla hugged her waist. We're a real family now. Noah handed her another stone, a small heart-shaped one he had kept for a special moment. Ethan slid the ring onto her finger, his hands unsteady with emotion. Rosemary wrapped her arms around him, and he held her tightly. The boys joined the embrace seconds later, arms around legs and waists and shoulders, forming a tangled, messy, perfect huddle. Outside, the snowfall grew thicker, blanketing the city in white. Inside, warmth radiated from the 5 of them, so much love it filled every corner, every shadow, every scar. Later, as they drank cocoa and danced badly to Christmas music, Rosemary kept staring at the ring, overwhelmed not by the stone but by what it meant. She had walked into this penthouse months ago as a temporary maid. Now she stood in it as part of a family she never dared to dream of. Ethan kissed her forehead gently. Welcome home, he whispered. For the first time in her life, Rosemary truly felt it. She whispered back, I'm home. And this time it was forever. At its heart, this story teaches that family is not defined by blood status or the circumstances of one's birth, but by the courage to show up for one another through fear, grief, and uncertainty. The Walkers were a family shattered by loss, living in the shadow of a tragedy they never learned to confront. Ethan tried to replace presence with productivity, believing that financial stability could compensate for emotional absence. The boys carried wounds too heavy for their small bodies, each one expressing pain in different ways: anger, anxiety, withdrawal. The penthouse looked perfect from the outside, but inside it echoed with unmet needs. Into this fragile world entered Rosemary, someone society underestimated because of her job title, her simplicity, and her quiet way of loving. And yet, she became the one who taught them that healing begins with consistency, compassion, and the willingness to sit with someone in their darkest moments. One of the central lessons of this story is that emotional presence matters far more than material provision. Ethan provided everything money could buy, but the boys still felt abandoned because what they needed most couldn't be purchased. They needed reassurance, stability, gentleness, things Rosemary gave freely, not as a duty, but as an instinctive expression of her character. She showed them that love is built through small moments, cutting fruit the way Caleb preferred. Letting Liam draw out his frustration instead of punishing him, accepting Noah's wordless gifts as priceless treasures. Those ordinary acts created extraordinary trust. The lesson here is powerful. Where affection is offered without expectation, children learn to feel safe again. And when adults learn to truly listen, they rediscover parts of themselves long buried. Another theme is the danger of fear-driven control. Margaret believed she was protecting her family, but her choices were rooted in pride and misunderstanding. She assumed that wealth created a world where emotions had to be controlled, not nurtured. She clung to the illusion that outsiders were threats rather than potential blessings. Her attempt to remove Rosemary was not born of malice but of a belief that vulnerability equaled weakness. Yet she learned painfully that withholding love causes far more damage than extending it. Her repentance reminds us that even those who make harmful choices can grow if they are willing to face the consequences of their actions. Forgiveness in this story is not given lightly. It is earned through humility, acknowledgement, and a commitment to change. The story also teaches that love requires bravery. Rosemary's decision to leave, though misguided, came from a place of fear that she would someday hurt the boys by not being enough. Ethan's choice to chase her across states was an act of a man finally confronting the truth. Running from grief had only widened the wounds in his home. The boy's willingness to seek her, despite fearing rejection, shows courage in its purest form. And Rosemary's decision to return was perhaps the bravest of all. She chose to face the possibility of heartbreak to give the family a chance to become whole. Love didn't happen because life was perfect. It bloomed because each character chose courage over fear, connection over retreat. Another lesson woven throughout the story is that healing is messy, nonlinear, and often built in partnership with others. None of the Walkers healed alone. Liam learned control because Rosemary taught him emotional tools Ethan never knew he needed. Caleb's anxiety eased because he was finally seen, understood, and guided with tenderness. Noah regained his spark because someone valued his quiet language instead of forcing him to change. Ethan reconnected with his children not because he suddenly became the perfect father, but because he allowed himself to be imperfect, burning pancakes, tying shoes wrong, sitting on the floor with wobbly Lego structures. Healing came through presence, not perfection. The story reminds us that progress is made not in grand gestures but in daily choices to grow. The arc of the story also highlights that chosen family can be just as meaningful, if not more, than biological ties. Rosemary was not supposed to be part of this family. Society placed her in a box, defining her by income and occupation. Yet she became the emotional heartbeat of the Walkers. She earned trust through her actions, not through entitlement. The boys invited her into their world not because she demanded it, but because she offered a love they desperately needed. Ethan fell for her not because she filled a void left by Grace, but because she honored that lost love while offering something new, a gentle strength that made him want to become a better man. The lesson shines brightly: family grows wherever genuine love is welcomed. Forgiveness plays a crucial role as well. Rosemary forgave Ethan for not protecting her sooner. Ethan forgave himself for the years he lost in grief. The boys forgave Rosemary for leaving because they understood in their own way that she left out of fear, not rejection. And perhaps the most unexpected forgiveness came when Margaret acknowledged her wrongdoing. Her apology was not a dramatic gesture. It was quiet, vulnerable, deeply human. The story teaches that forgiveness does not erase pain, but it allows love to move forward without being chained to past mistakes. Healing becomes possible only when people are willing to acknowledge their faults and try again. Finally, the Christmas proposal symbolizes the ultimate lesson of the story: love becomes strongest when it is built on truth, mutual respect, and shared healing. Ethan didn't propose out of loneliness or desperation. He proposed because through every hardship, Rosemary remained the person who made the house feel alive. The boys participated because they saw her as their anchor, not their nanny. The entire journey, grief, conflict, separation, reconciliation, led to a moment where every heart in that penthos understood what real family meant. The proposal wasn't about romance alone, it was about building a future rooted in trust, love, and collective growth. The story teaches that home is not a place. It is a choice, a daily commitment to show up for the people who make life worth living. And sometimes, the person who changes our world forever comes when we least expect it, wearing no crown, carrying no accolades, offering nothing but compassion. Yet the compassion can rebuild everything we lost. This is a story about healing, chosen family, forgiveness, and the courage to love again. And the greatest lesson of all is that love, real, transformative love, begins the moment someone decides to stay. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of my latest videos. If you have any ideas or topics you'd like me to cover, leave a comment below. I always read all your comments.